For thousands of years before the discovery of gold, Native Americans traveled through and inhabited the area that the Sierra Nevada's melting snow spilled dramatically over rocky cliffs into the valley, where waterfalls sat over 3,000 feet above its floor. The treasures the park holds are unduplicated, each wonder differing from the next, each overwhelmingly spectacular. From 1850 to 1851, Native Americans and Euro-American miners in the area were at war, the Mariposa War. Some Euro-American men had formed a militia known as the Mariposa Battalion. The Mariposa Battalion's purpose was to drive the native Ahwahneechee people onto reservations. They were the first non-natives to enter Yosemite. When this war ended, Yosemite was then open to settlement and speculation. Today, we're going to talk about Jennie Curry, half of the Curry couple who founded Camp Curry in Yosemite National Park, and the history of the Yosemite Firefalls. Season 3 features inspiring, gallant, even audacious stories of real 19th century women from the Wild West. Stories that contain adult content, which may be disturbing to some listeners or secondhand listeners, so discretion is advised. I'm Andrea Anderson, and this is Queens of the Mines, Season 3. Between 1855 and 1864, the Yosemite Valley had 653 visitors. After the completion of stage roads into the valley, the number rose to 2,700 people annually within its first decade. Abraham Lincoln signed the Yosemite Grant on June 30th, 1864, and Yosemite Valley was then placed under the protection of the state of California. The act preserved the valley for public use and recreation for all time. Some of the earliest visitors were artists, authors, painters, illustrators, and photographers who came to publicize the valley. Hotels were built, and stagecoach companies started bringing tourists on the long journey in. 6 years later, James Macaulay, an Irish sailor and miner, arrived in Yosemite, and he took a job in a sawmill working alongside John Muir. Macaulay soon built a horse trail from the base of Sentinel Rock up to Glacier Point. It was over a 4-mile route which climbed 3,200 feet. At Glacier Point, he built a small shack, which he named the Mountain House. Macaulay charged a toll for the trail, and the Mountain House provided concessions and lodging to its travelers. One night in 1872, Macaulay and his school-aged sons kicked a campfire over the ledge at Glacier Point. The act quite literally sparked the idea of a money-making venture, a firefall. They would collect a fee from tourists in the valley during the day to build a modest fire and push it off the cliff at night. He experimented with versions of fireworks that he would lower on wires from the overhanging rock nearby. The attempts seemed insignificant from the valley floor, so he returned to the idea of pushing over the embers. Macaulay bought both of his 8-year-old boys mules, and the young Macaulay twins attended school by riding them down the 4-mile trail to the valley. It took 90 minutes. While in the valley, they would collect $1.50 from tourists who wanted to see a firefall, and then would ride the trail back up to Glacier Point with a pack mule, packing wood, and carrying provisions for the hotel. On the 4th of July, a collection often amounted to $10 or $20. Busy days like that required hauling wood for at least 2 days. Macaulay soon leased Mountain House to others to manage, and that was when the state of California took possession of all Yosemite claims in 1874. In 1880, he leased Mountain House back from the state. The couple was evicted by the state in 1897 for failure to maintain it. Macaulay was killed accidentally on a runaway horse, and the firefalls stopped. For years, they were almost forgotten. In 1899, David and Jennie Etta Curry and their children took the wild ride down the old Coulterville Road with the stagecoach driver Eddie Webb to their new home in Yosemite Valley. Both David and Jennie had studied under David Starr Jordan at Indiana University, where they had both graduated in 1883. The Currys had a unique love for nature. Their previous work involved taking parties through Yellowstone with a movable camp. David and Jennie saw an opportunity. They received permission from the Guardian of the Valley, which was the state park at the time, to use the site of its camp. With 7 tents, they opened a family campground at the base of Glacier Point, and they called it Camp Curry. It is wild if you think about it, furnishing a business like that in a location like that before means of modern transportation. Bare tents, burlap for the floors, mattresses, bed springs on wooden legs, clean bedding, chairs, and tables were brought in by wagon from Merced, which was 100 miles away. Camp Curry opened in June of 1899, charging $2 per night, the first affordable accommodation in the park. Accommodations at the Sentinel Hotel were $4 a night. Jennie was fondly known throughout the valley as Mother Curry, the power behind the throne. Her personality would truly contribute to their success. She was big in mind, soul, and body, and interested in people and in life. Of course, women's domestic skills were highly valued in the West. But like many pioneering women, Jennie had to find a way to broaden the roles beyond the cult of true womanhood, which we've mentioned in the book and in previous episodes. Jennie helped plan additional guest services, made the beds, packed the box lunches for adventures. She would say that she had done every job around camp, from baking dozens of pies or loaves of bread to making lye soap from wood ashes in a huge open kettle. All but the duties of the porter. The Currys, in fact, did do all the work around camp with the exception of one paid employee, the cook, and 2 or 3 students from Stanford who worked for a designated time in exchange for a week's vacation with room and board. During the first season, the camp expanded to 25 tents with almost 300 guests. 300 of the 4,500 people who visited the Yosemite Valley that year, but it was a pretty good start. Many of the guests came from Curry's educational network. The crowds predicted Camp Curry would fail. It was cold and isolated, but the Currys were determined. They had ideas. The memory of the Firefall was eventually brought up, and Mr. Curry decided to revive the tradition on holidays, or when prominent guests were in the valley. Men would gather wood on the ledge trail and build a 12-foot wide, 4-foot tall mound of firewood. At 4, they would light the fire, allowing the pile to burn down until it was a hill of glowing embers for 5 hours, until 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock in Yosemite meant firefall. It was an unwritten law that everything and everyone in the valley stopped at 9 p.m. David Curry would cup his hands to his mouth, raise his face toward Glacier Point, and bellow, "Hello, Glacier Point!" without the aid of a sound system or a megaphone. That's how he earned the nickname the Stentor. Stentor was that famous Greek who could command 10,000 troops without a megaphone. The fire tender at that point would reply, "Hello, Camp Curry! Is the fire ready? The fire's ready!" Followed by Curry's command, "Let her go, Gallagher! Let the fire fall! The fire's falling!" I'm guessing that Gallagher was the regular fire tender. The 2 men at the top, using extra long-handled, wide steel rakes, would alternate strokes to maintain a steady stream of cinders, plunging over the cliffs to their resting place on a ledge 1,700 feet below. It was a skill. It took practice to be able to push blazing hot coals for an extended period of time over a cliff in a steady stream down a granite wall, simulating a continuously flowing waterfall. It was a blazing stream of thousands and thousands of individually discernible red and gold sparks floating down the cliff in complete silence, the sparks flying away like shooting stars. 15 minutes later, the fall would grow smaller until it became a mere thread of gold, which drew the curtain of night before darkness descended. The railroad reaching El Portal in 1907 made travel to the gold rush in California much more accessible. For the park, it skyrocketed the ability of making improvements in equipment and efficiency. Jennie no longer needed to bring in furniture, food, or anything by wagon from Merced, the train ended only 15 miles away and the road there was easy. She was able to raise the comfort level of the camp for her ever-increasing number of guests with better kitchen equipment, dressers, bed frames, and rugs. The Firefall continued each night and held 20 minutes of enchantment, where thousands of onlookers felt something in common for that short period of time. Yosemite's grandeur was on full display. How unspeakably tall were its cliffs, how quiet its forest. The act, performed every night for many years, etched the surface of the granite, leaving a 1,000-foot-long white strip. From 1913 to 1916, the Yosemite Firefall tradition was halted by the Park Service over a disagreement between David Curry and the Assistant Secretary of the Interior. David Curry died in 1917, just before the Firefall was reinstated. Jennie, with the help of her children, carried on with running and expanding Camp Curry on lease from the government. The tradition carried on for decades. The song Indian Love Call, made popular in the 1936 film Rosemary, was eventually performed while the fire cascaded down the rock face. So much for the silence, I guess. The Firefall was halted during World War II when park facilities were used by the military. Jennie Curry died in October of 1948. The original purpose of the Firefall was to draw visitors to the park. 5 years after her death, Yosemite had reached 1 million visitors for the first time. In 1960, President John F. Kennedy visited Yosemite and was, according to various sources, either held up by an important phone call or was still eating dinner at 9 p.m. And the Firefall was held for a half an hour so he could see it, much to the displeasure of the rest of the visitors. By 1965, annual visitation had reached 2 million. The Firefall continued on each summer night for nearly 2/3 of the 20th century. Luckily, it never caused any forest fires, but other environmental impacts were mounting. For one, thousands of visitors were tramping through the meadows, driving their cars off the parked roads, trying to get the best view. They were leaving litter everywhere. There were thefts from the hotels and campgrounds when visitors were absent or distracted. And lastly, nearly every dead red fir tree accessible by road had been stripped of its bark for use as fuel. Rangers worked late nights untangling traffic jams while idling vehicles spit out exhaust into the park. There was just simply too many people, and the park canceled the Firefall. About 50 people gathered to mark the end of the tradition on January 25th, 1968, 55 years from the release of this episode. Funny how that worked out, huh? Although the Glacier Point Firefall is a thing of the past, a natural, even more awe-inspiring phenomenon that goes by the same name at Horsetail Falls remains. The organic illusion appears for a few weeks each February. Light from the setting sun hits the east side of El Capitan at Horsetail Falls at a precise angle, and it seems to be molten lava rushing 1,570 feet to the valley floor, creating a natural firefall. Ansel Adams captured it on film for the first time in 1940. The natural Yosemite Firefall can be finicky. Several factors must converge to trigger the firefall to glow. First, there has to be an adequate amount of snowpack for Horsetail Falls to be flowing, and the temperatures must be warm enough to melt the snow. The sky also needs to be clear at sunset. If conditions are cloudy, the sun's rays will be blocked and everything's ruined. But if everything comes together and conditions are just right, the Yosemite Firefall will light up for about 10 minutes. The sun hits Yosemite Valley at roughly the same angle in October, but the lack of runoff prevents the same phenomenon. The discovery of Horsetail Falls is not well documented. There's no doubt that the Ahwahneechee, who lived in Yosemite Valley for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, knew of its existence. But there's no evidence that they passed the knowledge to the white settlers. Love that. Makes perfect sense. The local lore of Elmer is also linked to the Firefalls. And unless you've been in the park at night, you might not know what I'm talking about. In the 1930s, a child by the name of Elmer would drift off with his friends to their own place or to watch the Firefall every night. It was a common thing in Yosemite to hear after the firefall a mother calling back to camp for her son. Elmer, Elmer. It all leads me to wonder, what's the most spectacular thing from nature that you've ever seen? Queens of the Mines was created and produced by me, Andrea Anderson. You can support Queens of the Mines on Patreon or purchasing the book Queens of the Mines. Paperback, hardback, and Kindle versions are available on Amazon. This season's theme song is by This Lonesome Paradise. You can find their music anywhere, but you should support the band by buying their music and merch at thislonesomeparadise.bandcamp.com.